Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And it's the latest of our Glasgow Film Festival podcasts. And I'm joined by filmmaker Heather Croall. Hello, Heather.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about your film, Yer Old Faither, as it should be said, which is such a delightful film. How do you explain it to people when they ask about the film?
Well, it's a tricky one. I mean, it is it's a personal film in so many ways about my relationship with my dad, but also about my dad. But then the film is about so much more. It is a personal film, but then it's also a film about a way of living, a way of a way of life in a remote town. It's got a sort of it opens up political themes of environmentalism,
Yeah.
and all sorts. So while it's very personal, it's also I think it opens up into all sorts of broader themes, and so it's hard to explain. And then when people see it, they are a really, incredible response that I've had from the film so far. People have just told me how much it resonated with them. It made them think of their own father, their own family, their own upbringing. And so, yes, it's, I think it does have, it connects well with a lot of people once they've seen it.
Yeah,
Because I think
absolutely.
that I think sometimes people think, oh, a film about your own dad, So I don't want to. I tried to make sure it wasn't an indulgent film, so and to make sure that it is something that speaks to a broader audience.
Yeah, and you've got this incredible footage, because it seemed to me that your family seemed to film almost everything at a time when it was quite unusual to do that.
Yeah, so well, I started studying film in the late 80s, early 90s at I was studying documentary, and I did used to film dad a little bit every now and again in that time, not very often. It's funny that you think that we filmed a lot, because actually that is just the sign of how great the editor was to make it look like that. But she pretty much used every minute that I had.
All right,
There wasn't
brilliant.
a lot. No, there wasn't a lot from the early years, but my editor, Tanya Nemi, was so incredible. She would find these little golden moments that were only even a few seconds in old footage that I had, which I miraculously found in a box in the shed. And it was all old VHS tapes and things like that. I mean, how I even still had it 30 years later, I don't know. But she used to find these little snippets and then say, oh, we can weave that in here and there. And so it does make it look like we filmed a lot more than we did. And I did film my dad when he was working as a doctor in the hospital. Only for a couple of days I filmed there in the 90s, in the early 90s. And then, but again, Tanya was so great at the editing, it made it look like I had a lot more than I really had.
It's so interesting, because I had the impression that your dad basically never had a camera out of his face, but that wasn't the case. It was just those.
No. Funny, I did in the 90s I won with a short film. I won a camera which was a mini DV camera with a little flip out screen, and I won that camera at a short film competition, and I gave it to my dad because he wanted to film the chimneys in the steelworks.
Yeah.
And it was to my amazement 30 years later that he told me he'd been filming the chimneys all these years, since that time that I gave him the camera. And so that was the other thing that I found. I found the tapes that I'd shot years ago of dad, but I also found his tapes that he'd shot over the years of the chimneys since I gave him this camera. And and then obviously his letters were a massive part of the film as well. Yeah. So there were treasure troves that we found that were pieced together whether it be the old footage or whether it be the footage he filmed of the chimneys, which was quite amazing how many different sunsets and sunrises and different days he'd filmed the chimneys when I played back the tapes. And then obviously his massive treasure trove of letters as well.
He was a man of obsessions, it seemed. It wasn't just enough for him to take one film of the chimneys. He had to do it multiple times. It wasn't just enough to write a few letters. There's screeds of letters that's everywhere. But also, and we'll come on to that, is it wasn't just enough for him to plant a couple of trees. He almost had to replant the whole of the town. Can you tell us a bit about his obsession and his nature?
Yeah, he didn't like to waste 1 minute. I mean, he would never be idle. He would never watch TV, for example, except Match of the Day. We used to watch the soccer or football, as you call it. And he loved watching football. But he wouldn't have a clue what happened on television ever. I think Z Cars, he used to say that was the last time he watched TV, was, in the 60s, I think, Z Cars. And so he never wasted a minute. Any minute he was doing, it was like writing letters, reading books, planting trees, building wooden tables, building stone walls, or delivering babies at the hospital. He found it amazing that people, he never had a mobile phone or anything like that. And he just couldn't believe the screen time that everybody was wasting. He just saw that as a waste. So every minute was precious and every minute was used. And I remember one asking him not long before he died about just what does he think, what would he think about himself? How would he sort of like to be remembered or whatever? And he said, well, as long as I was useful, that's all I want to be, is useful. And that was so much how he lived. He just wanted to make sure that he was useful every minute, everything he did. He lived he would never be, he would be completely unaware of the whole being present, the movement about being in the moment and being present. But actually that's exactly what he was. He was like, if you were sitting here with him talking, you would know that he was with you completely and totally with you, and in a conversation. He was very curious and very interested in everybody, and he was very present, and he was never distracted, and he was right there with you. And in the way he was right there, whatever he was doing, whether it was building the tables and of course it was not enough to build the tables, but he had to make the planks himself, and and then with stone walls, he had to go collect the stones from any which way. Like if anyone was digging up their garden, Whyalla is built on stones, so there would be lots of stones, and he'd have to go and collect them, and then he'd build a wall. So he would never like to go to a shop and buy something. He had to try and discover it and forage it in some way. And with the tree planting, I mean, that was an obsession that was, decades long, and also nobody knew he was doing it. So
I love that,
he just did it as his daily ritual, and so he used to he wouldn't buy seedlings or anything. He would pick the gum nuts and actually germinate them himself in the oven, and then he'd have to and then they'd grow the little seedlings in our back garden, recycled old fruit cans and dog food cans and things. And then we'd have to go, and when I was young, I used to go out with him a lot in the morning. And because Whyalla was a dry desert dusty town, you'd have to water it a lot morning and night, and we'd have to take the water in buckets to the trees. There was no hoses, so he always planted trees, it seemed very strange. When I was 10 years old and doing this, I was like, what are we doing and why are we doing this? But then, when he got diagnosed with very advanced cancer with not long to go, and I was, in my 40s, and I got back to look after him, and he said, right, let's go plant trees. It was like, I suddenly remembered that's what we used to do. And I'd sort of forgotten that we did it. But then I remembered, this is what we used to do when I was young. And I think I have a brother and a sister, but for some reason I was always the one that was doing the trees with him, and so it was amazing when he was in nearly 80 to be going out again planting trees with him. And he even planted trees up until probably 3 or 4 days before he died. And I was thinking, who's going to water these trees? But all of his lovely friends in Whyalla have told me in the last 7 years they've been watering him, and that even those final trees that he planted are still growing and alive. And now when you go to Whyalla, because he planted thousands and thousands of trees, the whole skyline and the landscape of the town is, his mark of his trees is very, very visible. And that's why when I was doing the film, I was lucky enough that drone cameras started to be coming out, at the time that I was making the films. It would have been impossible years ago to get a crane shot or something. But, so, in the last few years, drone photography became so more accessible. And so I was able to capture, I think, the way that my dad has left such an impact on the landscape of the town.
Absolutely. And to go back to that idea of not wasting anything, that included water. You're standing, saving the water from your shower, from washing the dishes, so it could be taken to water the plants.
Absolutely. He was extreme. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he would make at least 4 or 5 cups of tea from a tea bag. If he sliced some bread, he would get the crumbs and put them in. He'd collect them all in a bag, so that when he was going to crumb some fish down the line in a couple of weeks, he'd been collecting his crumbs. I mean, it is extreme recycling.
I have to say, the most extreme for me was the recycling of the tissues.
Oh yeah. Well, that was just insane. Like, that was something that came quite late in life, and as it wasn't something we all lived. But it came about. I remember one day someone said to him, "Oh, what do you think of microwaves?" And he said, "Oh, well, the only reason I ever use a microwave is to reheat my cup of tea or microwave my tissue." And I was like, "What?" Because I didn't live at home anymore when I heard him say that, so I'd never seen it. But then when I moved back to look after him in his final year, I witnessed the microwaving of the tissue quite often.
That's incredible. But actually, this is a man who really did leave his legacy on the town, not only by changing the landscape, but he worked in obstetrics. He delivered children. He delivered a lot of the people who went on to then have their own kids and all of that. And it's quite a legacy to leave.
Amazing. He was delivering babies in that town for 40 years or so, more, I think 45. And he was, even towards the end, he was delivering babies where he had delivered the mother and the grandmother. So, 3 generations of the family. And it's, the regional healthcare in Australia, it's really tough. Like, not many specialists go and live in remote desert. They get serviced by doctors that fly in and fly out. They don't live there.
Yeah.
Whereas my dad was very committed to the community from the day he arrived. And he really loved to, and he didn't choose to go and live in he could have gone and made a lot of money in Sydney or Melbourne, but he chose to live in a very working class town with no one using private healthcare at all. It was very much a working class town, and it was much more for him about being useful and servicing, serving the town and delivering giving the women the healthcare they deserved, even though they were in a remote town.
Yeah.
And I mean, I did much later in my life, not from when we were young, we didn't know this, but much later when I traveled to visit my auntie in Glasgow, and I discovered that he'd actually trained to be a priest and lived in Rome for all those years. And there's a part of me, I think, that I see there's a parallel how he served the town was a little bit priest-like. You know, he wanted to serve the community in that priest-like way, but not as a priest,
Yeah.
as a doctor that delivered the babies. And yeah, so I mean, he was full of eccentricities as well. I mean, people come up to me in the street all the time. If ever I go back to my town, they was telling me, they go into great detail about their birth without even, you know, as much of an introduction. They go dive straight into these gruesome details. But then they've also got great stories of, you know, dad with his canary yellow bicycle that he used to ride around. Yeah, he used to cycle up and down in the hospital and, you know, in the wards, and you know, drive around in his crazy old Volvo. So he was always trying to make people laugh, and he wanted to bring a bit of joy into the hospital. And because I think, you know, people think hospitals are a bit depressing, so he was always doing crazy antics in the hospital and making everyone laugh. So he's pretty unforgettable kind of character.
Absolutely. And I mean, and the car itself, it's the closest I've seen to a real life clown car where you shut the door and the whole thing falls apart. But he's still like, no, it's okay, it's fine. Tell us a little bit about Whyalla itself, because the town is almost a character in its own right.
Yeah, so it's a steel town in the desert where the desert meets the sea. I mean, it's a phenomenal setting, really. It was a company town that BHP sort of invented in the 30s or 40s, and they decided that the port, or the water there, was deep enough for big ships. So they did a shipyard. So it was a combination of a steelworks and a shipbuilding town. And you know, there was in the 60s and 70s, I mean, the place was full of people from all over the world. I mean, you know, Yugoslav people had come from, you know, well, there was a lot of Glaswegians because there was a lot of people from shipyards and things like that. But there was people from all through Eastern Europe, and all through India, and so it was it was actually a very multicultural town when it was booming, because it was working class but very booming town. And because everyone had a job, everyone was working either in the steelworks or the shipyards. But over the years, obviously, that was the shipyards went first in probably 1978 or not 79, and then after that, the steelworks jobs, you know, were shrinking and shrinking, and to the point that, you know, when Dad was dying, the steelworks actually went into receivership. So there was something quite amazing about Dad dying as well as the town sort of dying at the same time. But it's yeah, classic, sort of a bit like a mining town, I guess, you know.
Yeah.
Towns that boomed in working class towns that boomed in the 60s and 70s, and then really went into decline. But yeah, so I mean, it's sort of a Whyalla. Australians kind of think of it as like just like totally the worst place in Australia. My dad had, you know, he had a great sense of social justice, and he was very strongly committed to that sort of fighting for the underdog, and making sure that he always felt Whyalla didn't deserve its reputation, but also that it deserved more support from the government, because it was often overlooked. And you know, he even in his letters, he used to write letters to, because it's a very hot and dry, dusty, no rain, you know. He used to write letters in the 1980s, you know, to try and convince governments to set up solar farms and wind farms there. And it was, yeah, no, quite ironic that now that Dad has passed away, that is, you know, not long after he died, they started building the solar farms, the wind farms there. So 40 years after he's written the letters. But he was always trying to fight for more for Whyalla, and he really loved it. And his love for Whyalla was sort of, you know, regarded by many as a bit like over the top, because most people, especially in the rest of Australia, are a bit like dismissive of Whyalla. So, but it was a great town to grow up, and we loved it. So
It made me think,
that's why
actually.
That's why I wanted to portray it in a beautiful, like, in a way, because it's often portrayed in a really negative light in the
Yeah.
media. And a lot of people from Whyalla, or people who have lived in Whyalla who don't live there anymore, who saw the film, said that they found the aerial shots of the town, almost quite emotional, like almost moving, sort of tugging on your heartstrings, because it was sort of like celebrating Whyalla as a beautiful place that it isn't very often celebrated.
It made me think actually of your dad's hometown, Glasgow, because it had a reputation, certainly pre 1990, of being a place where people didn't want to go to. It had a terrible
Yeah,
reputation. My gran, who was from the borders, whenever she came up to kind of visit us, still thought, oh, I'm going to be mugged in the street, or I'm going to be, there was that kind of reputation. And he has this pride, which I think he wants to make where he is better rather than go somewhere else, which might be easier
yeah,
or more beautiful. She
yeah,
says, no, we're going to stay where we are and make this place better. And I have to say, I think both your mum, your dad and your mum, this kind of, I would typify it as a Scottish kind of sheer bloody mindedness. No, we at one point, it's like, no, this is where we are and we'll make it
yeah,
better. We'll make it good for
yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah, and I think, my mum's she's just an anchor for my dad. Really,
Yeah,
she was dad was a bit of a rudderless ship in many ways, I thought, or sort of, he was off with he was a dreamer, and he didn't really know much about the day-to-day administration of life, whereas mum, kept everything going for all of us and for him. And but they had a beautiful, just a beautiful relationship, and and they lived in this remote town, and they never hankered for, they never missed, they just sat down. Sitting down for dinner was just all about talking about what's going on in the world, or what happened that day, or the politics. There was never any gossip or anything like that. So they're very, they just arrived, and there they lived, and loved it. And mum, um I think some people feel surprised that my mum, just was willing to even move to such a place, but she was happy there, and happy to go there.
yeah, it seemed that wherever they went, as long as they were doing it together, then that was enough.
Yeah.
You would do it, which was
Mm.
absolutely lovely. Um, what's interesting for me was you mentioned that he was training to be a priest. And there is that kind of, well, that's something you only discovered later in life, isn't it, when you went home and saw these pictures?
Yeah.
And the kind of two jobs, if you like, almost rub up against each other. And you do touch upon that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I did, this comes to the amazing editor again. I mean, I did not think that there was any way that I could fit reference about dad living in Rome and training to be a priest into this film. Like, I just felt like, well, I had this footage of filming him when he was ill and dying, and then I had the earlier footage, and then I had letters, but how was I going to tell something about him training to be a priest and so on? But one, we found in the interview, him talking about being Catholic and being an obstetrician, and doing abortions, and just talking about that whole challenge of well, working in obstetrics, doing abortions, and then how could you continue to be, Catholic, and the questioning of that all the time. And so the editor was just, yeah, she just came to me one day with this whole interwoven scene about dad's talking about those challenges, as well as bringing in the whole story about him going off to Rome and being a priest. So I mean, I just didn't imagine that we were ever going to get that part of the story in. She was amazing like that. She also did a similar intercutting with when dad really was the moment of dad being diagnosed, um, and intercutting that with television news stories of the steelworks going into receivership, and the steelworks possibly closing down. And so she really, she took pieces, that quite complex pieces of storytelling, and would produce these amazing intercut pieces that that took you on an emotional journey. I mean, there's a moment when we found the letter that he wrote his mother in the 1950s when he's leaving Rome, and I mean, the way that the way she uses that letter, it's actually really moving. And him leaving Rome, and obviously leaving after 7 years of training to be a priest, he's not going to follow through with that. And I mean, I'm totally an atheist, and we don't have. I just found the way she edited that was so moving. It was like, to see that someone's majorly changing the direction in their life, and obviously his mum, who always would have loved him to still be a priest, would have been very sad to get that letter. And I was in awe of the editor being able to include those pieces, and they never felt didactic, or they felt emotionally connected to the story.
Yeah. Well, it was like another generation. It was him almost referring to his own parents, and as you say, maybe this was their big dream for him, was to become a priest, and that was saying, no, that dream is now over, and do something else.
That's it. So yeah, I met his childhood friend Ronnie O'Connor, and when I went to see him, I wasn't sure why. I mean, I was just thought, I'll just film Ronnie. I just film Roke. I knew that Dad had written letters to Roke, but I never expected that we were going to find those letters. And then when I got to his house, he said, "Oh, I've kept all your dad's letters over the last 40 years, and they're here in the bottom drawer of this bureau."
Wow.
And I couldn't believe that. And he, I interviewed him on camera, and then I scanned his letters, and he said to me, "Oh, can I have them back? Because they're, sentimental, and he likes to reread them." And I said, "Of course." And then about 2 years later, we got word, we had a message that Roke had passed away.
Oh, right.
And his niece called my mother and said that and I said, "Oh, when you clear the flat out, if there's those letters in the bureau." And she said, "Oh no, we got rid of the bureau."
Oh.
But luckily I'd scanned them all. But they were beautiful. They were all handwritten in the old aerogram, in the old blue paper. But luckily I'd scanned them all. And then again, the editor just found a way to weave in all the letters. And originally the animator was going to just animate mainly my childhood memories.
Yeah.
But then as we started to use the letters more, we realized we wanted to animate the letters as well. So that was great. And then I met Gary McNair, who I met him in Edinburgh at the Fringe, and he was doing this play called A Gambler's Guide to Dying, which was about his granddad.
Yeah.
And so I asked him, if I ever make this film, would you be the voice of my dad's letters? And so when COVID hit and Melbourne was in lockdown, and people were in lockdown all over the world, and I'd been trying to edit this film for 5 years and not really having much luck. And the editor that I really wanted, who I'd asked years ago, and she said she wanted to do it, but she was heavily booked out. And she rang me up in about April and said, "Did you ever make that documentary?" And I said, "No, I'm still trying." She said, "Well, I'm in lockdown and all my films have been cancelled, so why don't you send me the drives?" So I sent her all the footage, and she edited it in lockdown in Melbourne. Gary was recording the letters in his shed in Scotland, the animator. So everyone was completely separated, and in lockdown we weren't ever together. And then the sound mixing was happening in a bit, so I could never, as the director, I was never almost in the room with anyone because we weren't allowed to. But luckily the creative, everyone was amazing at the element they were doing.
Yeah.
And they just were given the creative freedom. I was never leaning over them, and the musician, the composer, the musical director, she moved from London to Adelaide to be with her new partner, and so she was available, and it was all because of COVID. I mean, she would have never moved here if it wasn't COVID. So in a funny way, the film is only it's only there because of the pandemic.
I have to say, I mean, those are two elements that stuck out to me. The animation is lovely, particularly, you and your dad and the dog in the front seat in the car. It's just fantastic. And also the use of music, because you've got traditional, you've got some jazz, you've got some kind of more atmospheric stuff. And then at the end, you've got a lovely rendition of Caledonia, which, almost brought me to tears listening to it. Yeah, you can tell that every aspect of this film is made with love and care, which is great.
Yeah, and I think people have really commented on that a lot, in terms of, that's, I think, where it becomes very heartfelt to the audience members individually, is just the amount of love that is in the film, and also how much it makes them think of their own fathers and their own family.
Very
and
much.
I did think a little bit when I was filming Dad, when he was really going downhill and he only had a few weeks left and he was getting very frail, and I thought, should I even film him? I'd just have a camera sitting on the shelf or something. He wouldn't really even, it wouldn't be like in his face. But people have said to me, oh, I'm so glad that you did film that, because for anyone who's cared for someone right till the end like that, there's this quiet dignity of when people know their time's up, and there's no drama, there's no panic, it's just happening. But it's such a privilege to be there with them and look after them. And my dad was just trying to wring out every single minute of life. Like, he didn't want to just lie back and die, he wanted to still do things. And to see that on screen is it's not very often seen. And that's something a lot of people have told me, that they've looked after their own parents or other friends or something, and there's something about those last few weeks of someone's life, and I'm just like, there was a couple of moments that I thought, oh, I don't know if I should include this, mainly for my mum. I wasn't sure, like when the ambulance came, and mum's looking very worried and sort of pacing behind, and obviously my mum was a nurse, so she met Dad in Glasgow as a midwife. So she was half in the nurse medical mode and half in the wife losing her husband mode, and so she'd be sort of half practical, but I could see her emotions as well. But that was one thing she did say. Oh, the scene when the ambulance come and then we just go out the gate, and then they take him out the gate. She said, oh, that was probably the hardest moment, I think, for Mum to see. But other than that, it was I think beautiful to be able to share that time on screen of what it's like to just nurse and be with someone that you've loved all your life as they're in their final days.
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely a beautiful film, and it does kind of resonate. There's so many universal themes in it, and to take what's such a personal, individual subject and do that, I think, is something pretty special. Heather, thank you so much for talking to us today. I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the film.
Thank you so much, and I hope hopefully it will be loved in the Glasgow Film Festival screenings.
I'm sure it will. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.